While you were learning about Egypt and Mesopotamia in school, there was already a city on the other side of the planet with pyramids, a functioning government, and an orchestra that your textbook never once mentioned. It's 5,000 years old. It predates the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it was sitting in plain sight the entire time. By the end of this video, you're going to understand not just what this city was, but why the way it fed thousands of people without any grain farming completely broke the academic model of how civilizations are supposed to work. That discovery changed everything historians thought they knew, and it starts with the anchovies. Everything you learned about the first civilizations is missing one giant piece. While Egypt was still figuring out how to build pyramids, there was already a city in South America with its own pyramids, its own government, its own music, and its own fully functioning society. And somehow nobody told you about it. The civilization that got left out of every history book. There is a place in the desert of Peru, about 180 kilometers north of Lima, sitting in a dry river valley surrounded by nothing but sand and mountains. No trees, no river right next to it, no obvious reason why anyone would build anything there. And yet 5,000 years ago, thousands of people built one of the most advanced cities on the planet in that exact spot. It's called Caral, and it is older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the ancient cities of China and India that you probably learned about in school. It is, by every serious scientific measure, one of the oldest cities ever found on Earth, and it existed in a place that most people, even today, never think of when they think about ancient civilizations. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what Caral was, what they built, how they lived, what made them so advanced, and why the fact that you've probably never heard of them says something pretty uncomfortable about the way history gets taught. What were the first civilizations supposed to be? Before we get into Caral, let's set the stage. When most people go through school, they learn about the same handful of ancient civilizations. Egypt, Mesopotamia, that's modern-day Iraq, the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan and India, ancient China along the Yellow River. These four are usually called the cradles of civilization, the places where complex human society supposedly started, where writing was invented, where cities were built, where organized government and religion and trade first appeared. This is what textbooks have said for generations. There's just one problem. Caral doesn't fit into this story, and rather than update the story, most of the world just quietly ignored Caral for a very long time. How Caral was found, and then ignored. Here's something that will make your jaw drop a little. Caral wasn't some hidden underground city that nobody knew existed until a dramatic discovery in the jungle. The ruins were sitting right there, completely visible in an open desert valley. Archaeologists had actually visited the site as far back as the 1940s. They looked at the large mounds, some of them rising 30 meters into the air, and assumed they were just natural hills, or maybe simple platforms. Nothing special. They moved on. For decades, nobody took a close look. Then in the 1990s, a Peruvian archaeologist named Ruth Shady Solis decided to actually dig. What she found underneath those natural hills changed everything. They weren't hills. They were pyramids. Massive, carefully constructed stone pyramids. 6 major ones, along with dozens of smaller platforms and structures spread across an area of around 60 hectares. That's roughly the size of 84 football fields. And when her team began carbon dating the materials they found, the organic materials woven into the construction, things like plant fibers and reeds, the dates that came back were almost unbelievable. The oldest sections of Caral dated to approximately 3000 BC. That's 5,000 years ago. The Great Pyramids of Giza weren't built until around 2560 BC. Caral was already centuries old by the time Egypt started stacking those famous stones. What they actually built. The city was not a small settlement. It was not a collection of huts. It was a planned, organized, complex urban center with distinct neighborhoods, public spaces, and monumental architecture. The 6 main pyramids, which archaeologists call platform mounds, were enormous. The largest one, called the Pyramid Mayor, is about 160 meters long, 150 meters wide, and 28 meters tall. It took millions of cubic feet of stone and fill material to build, and it wasn't built once. It was expanded and renovated multiple times over hundreds of years, with new layers added on top of old ones, like a city growing upward over generations. Around the pyramids were sunken circular plazas, large open areas dug into the ground and lined with stone. These were clearly communal gathering spaces. Researchers believe they were used for ceremonies, public meetings, or performances. And speaking of performances, this is one of the details that hit differently when you really sit with it. Inside one of the buildings of Caral, archaeologists found 32 flutes. Not bone, not stone. These were flutes made from the bones of condors and pelicans, carefully drilled and shaped to produce specific musical notes. They also found 37 cornets, instruments made from deer and llama bones. These people had an orchestra 5,000 years ago in a desert in Peru. Someone actually sat down and carved a flute out of a condor bone and played music. That's not survival, that's culture. The problem that makes this even more interesting. When scientists and archaeologists study about ancient civilizations, one of the things they look for is what caused that civilization to develop. Usually the answer involves agriculture. Cities grow where farming is good. You need reliable food to feed a large population. You need grain, you need storage, you need the ability to produce more food than you need just to survive. What economists call a surplus. In every other early civilization, the agricultural surplus came from growing grain, wheat in Mesopotamia, wheat and barley in Egypt, rice in China. Caral had almost no grain. The desert around Caral is not farmland. There's no grain grown there in any significant quantity. The soil and climate weren't right for it. So how did a city of thousands of people feed itself? This is the question that stumped researchers for years after Caral was discovered. And the answer, when they finally found it, was so unexpected that it completely changed how historians think about what makes a civilization possible. The anchovy theory. About 20 kilometers from Caral, there is a coastline. And that coastline sits on top of one of the most productive stretches of ocean on the entire planet. The Humboldt Current, a cold ocean current running up the coast of South America that is absolutely packed with marine life. Fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and most importantly, anchovies. Millions and millions of anchovies. Here's what researchers figured out when they started looking at the relationship between Caral and the smaller coastal settlements nearby. The people at Caral were trading with the fishing communities on the coast. The coastal people would catch enormous quantities of fish, particularly anchovies, dry them, and send them inland to Caral. In exchange, Caral sent cotton. And the cotton wasn't for clothing, it was for fishing nets. Think about that system for a second. Caral grew cotton in the river valley, where they had access to irrigation water from Supe River. They turned that cotton into nets. They traded the nets to coastal fishermen. The fishermen used the nets to catch fish more efficiently than they ever could by hand. They sent the fish back to Caral, and Caral had protein to feed its population. This was a trade network, a deliberate, organized, mutually beneficial economic system between inland and coastal communities, operating 5,000 years ago. No grain required. This discovery, published in the journal Science in 2001 by Ruth Shady Solis and her colleagues, fundamentally shifted the academic understanding of how civilizations form. Before Caral, the accepted model was basically agriculture leads to surplus, surplus leads to cities. Caral showed that trade could do the same job. How they governed themselves. A city of thousands of people doesn't run itself. Somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to organize the labor to build pyramids. Somebody has to manage the trade. Somebody has to settle disputes and decide where new buildings go. So what kind of government did Caral have? Because in most early civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, early China, the answer to who's in charge involves a lot of violence. Kings who conquered and controlled, armies, weapons, evidence of warfare baked into the archaeological record. At Caral, researchers found almost no evidence of warfare. No weapons, no defensive walls around the city, no mass graves, suggesting battles or massacres, no trauma on skeletons consistent with organized violence. What they did find was evidence of a highly organized labor system, but one that appears to have been based on cooperation rather than force. Workers at Caral used a system called the mita, a labor contribution system where people gave their time and work to communal projects in exchange for food and other goods managed by the central authority. This system, interestingly, was later used by the Inca Empire thousands of years after Caral had already risen and fallen, suggesting that something about this model of social organization persisted in Andean culture for millennia. Trade, religion, ceremony, control of resources. Sound familiar? These are the tools that powerful people have used to stay powerful in every society in human history. Why did Caral disappear? Caral was occupied for roughly 1,000 years, from before 3000 BC to around 1800 BC. Then gradually people stopped living there. The leading theory involves environmental collapse. The Supe Valley is in a region heavily affected by El Niño, the climate pattern that periodically causes massive flooding and drought along the Pacific coast of South America. Evidence from the site suggests that around 1800 BC, the region experienced a series of severe El Niño events. Flooding would have destroyed the irrigation systems that made cotton farming possible. Drought would have followed, killing crops and disrupting the entire economic system that the city was built on. Without cotton, there were no nets. Without nets, there were no anchovies. Without anchovies, there were no food. And without food, there was no city. The people didn't die. They moved. They dispersed into smaller communities across the region, carrying their knowledge and their cultural practices with them. And some of what they knew, including that mita labor system, survived and was absorbed by later civilizations, eventually reaching the Inca thousands of years later. Caral didn't end in fire or conquest. It ended quietly, in stages, as the environment that made it possible stopped cooperating. What Caral changes about how we see history. The story of human civilization that most of us were taught is incomplete. Not wrong exactly, but shaped by who was doing the teaching, which discoveries got funded, which regions got attention, and which parts of the world were assumed, without much evidence to be where the important things happened. For a long time, the assumption was that civilization started in the Middle East and spread outward, that complex society was invented in one place and then copied or carried elsewhere. Caral proves that isn't true. On the other side of the planet, completely independently, thousands of people figured out how to build cities, organize governments, create art, develop trade networks, and sustain complex society. At exactly the same time as the civilizations we were all taught were the first, maybe even earlier. The question isn't why Caral existed. The question is what else is out there, sitting under a desert somewhere, waiting for someone to actually look. A city that was always there. 5,000 years ago, someone climbed to the top of a pyramid in Peru and looked out over a city they had built in the middle of a desert. Around them were thousands of people fishing, farming, weaving, trading, playing music on flutes made from condor bones. They didn't know about Egypt. Egypt didn't know about them. They just built something extraordinary in a place where nobody expected it. And then the desert covered it up, and the world forgot about them for 5,000 years. They were always there. We just weren't looking. Hit play on the next video. What's waiting for you there is just as buried and just as shocking as this.